the routine traffic stop turned suspicious. It was just past midnight in a quiet neighborhood outside of Washington, D.C., where the usual hum of city life had long faded into a peaceful stillness. The streets were dark, save for the occasional flicker of streetlights, casting long shadows across the empty pavement. A sense of tranquility hung in the air as Olivia Carter, an experienced undercover operative for a covert government agency, drove alone in her sleek, dark sedan. The night was hers, a moment of calm before her mission's end. She had spent months collecting intelligence, observing, and piecing together a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of local government. Tonight was supposed to be the quiet conclusion, a clean getaway, and then back to her team for debriefing. But life has a way of shattering the calm when you least expect it. As Olivia made her way through the neighborhood, she slowed at an intersection, her sharp eyes catching a glimmer of light reflecting off a stop sign. She came to a full stop, instinctively following the protocol that had been ingrained in her through years of training. It was a routine maneuver, a simple action, one that didn't warrant a second thought. But the sound of sirens abruptly tore through the silence, flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart didn't skip a beat. She wasn't nervous. She had been in situations far more dangerous than this, many times before. The calm she exuded was not just a product of her training, but also a sense of control, of knowing she was always one step ahead. She glanced in her side mirror, noting the approach of the squad car. It wasn't unusual for a police vehicle to stop a lone driver in the dead of night, but something about the way this one closed in felt off. She could feel the weight of the officer's gaze from behind, even before the car stopped inches from her own. Olivia's mind sharpened as she placed her hand on the wheel, her breath steady and measured. This stop was no longer routine. The officers who approached her were not only going to question her, they were about to make an irreversible mistake. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. The car's engine hummed quietly in the background as she prepared for what was to come. She had no choice but to face it head-on, knowing that the tension in the air was about to snap. As the officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached her vehicle, she assessed them. Two men, confident in their authority, but completely unaware that they had just picked the wrong target. False evidence and arrest. Officer Thomas Grant's boots crunched against the gravel as he moved toward Olivia's car, his partner, a younger officer named Jacob Reynolds, close behind. The two exchanged a brief glance, a silent communication that signaled their intent. Olivia remained perfectly still, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. The officers approached her window, their movements deliberate. Officer Grant, the taller of the two, leaned down, his flashlight cutting through the darkness and shining directly into Olivia's eyes. His voice, coated with practiced authority, pierced the calm night air. "Ma'am, do you know why we pulled you over?" Olivia's gaze met his without hesitation, unwavering, her eyes as calm as the night around them. "No, officer," she replied evenly, her voice steady but unflinching. "I wasn't speeding, and I came to a full stop at the intersection." Grant's lips curled into a tight, almost imperceptible smile, a slight condescension in his tone as he responded. "Actually, you failed to stop at the sign back there," he said, his words deliberate. "That's a moving violation." Olivia's brows furrowed slightly, a small reaction that hinted at her confusion but not her concern. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she said, her tone calm and confident. She didn't feel a hint of fear or anxiety. Those were emotions she had long since mastered in her line of work. The truth was, this was a setup. She had been trained to recognize the signs of such manipulation, and the officers before her were not as subtle as they thought. Grant's partner, Reynolds, lingered near the back of her car, his posture stiff and his gaze darting between the rear of the sedan and his superior. "Hey, Grant," he called out with a hint of eagerness in his voice. "You might want to take a look at this." Olivia didn't need to look to know what had just happened. She could feel the shift in their demeanor, the way their voices dropped into an almost conspiratorial whisper. Her mind raced, running through the possibilities. The bag had been planted. She was certain of it. She'd checked her car before she left the house, and it hadn't been there. This was no random encounter. It was orchestrated, rehearsed. Moments later, Grant returned to her window, his face now a mask of false seriousness. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he commanded, his tone sharpening. Olivia's expression remained neutral as she calmly asked, "May I ask why, officer?" "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances," Grant said, his voice now hard and calculating, as if he had already decided her fate. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, a subtle signal that she wasn't buying it. "Illegal substances?" she repeated, her voice steady, giving nothing away. "I think you've made a mistake." Grant gestured for her to exit the vehicle, his partner standing close by, a smug expression etched across his face. Olivia didn't hesitate. With deliberate calm, she stepped out of the car, her movements slow, precise, as if she had all the time in the world. Every gesture was controlled, calculated. She was not a woman to be intimidated or rushed. Reynolds theatrically opened the trunk of the car, pulling out a small, unmarked bag that appeared far too conveniently placed near the edge. "What do you know?" Reynolds said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "A bag of powdery goodness. Looks like we've got ourselves a winner here." Olivia's gaze flicked to the bag, her sharp mind already processing every detail. The bag hadn't been there when she left. She had no doubt about that. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This was a carefully planned act of corruption, a trap designed to take her down. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a calm, almost calculating expression that conveyed neither fear nor guilt. "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting," she replied, her voice smooth but with an underlying strength that neither officer seemed to recognize. Grant's expression twisted into one of irritation, misinterpreting her calm demeanor as arrogance. "You'll have your chance," he said coldly. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." As Reynolds moved to cuff her, Olivia allowed it without resistance, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly, her voice carrying an intensity that caused Reynolds to hesitate for just a fraction of a second before snapping the cuffs into place. Grant's smirk widened as he led her toward the squad car, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge," he said, clearly enjoying the moment. But Olivia didn't flinch. She was already calculating her next move. The officers thought they were in control, but they had no idea who they had just arrested. The ride to the station, and Olivia's calm demeanor. The squad car's engine hummed steadily as it cut through the silence of the night, the only sounds filling the air being the occasional crackle of the radio. Inside, Olivia sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, her posture unyielding. The officers in the front seat were lost in their own conversation, clearly pleased with what they believed was an easy victory. Officer Grant, ever the confident one, kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, his gaze filled with smug satisfaction. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds, eager to prove himself, kept his eyes on the road, his fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. They both believed they had just apprehended a common criminal, nothing more than a routine bust in a night filled with their usual insignificance. But Olivia was far from the common criminal they presumed her to be. She had been through far worse than this. She had stared down enemies who could tear apart entire organizations, and she had survived the most harrowing of situations with nothing but her mind and her skills. This arrest, this setup was nothing more than a slight detour in her plans. She wasn't worried, not one bit. As the squad car turned onto a quiet street, Olivia's mind began to piece everything together. She had already filed away every single detail of the encounter, every word, every action, every subtle movement from the officers. The planted evidence, the false accusations. They were all part of a larger scheme, one that had yet to fully unfold. What these officers didn't know was that they had just pulled a thread that would unravel everything they thought they controlled. Their chatter continued in the front seat, but Olivia barely heard it. Her thoughts were 100 steps ahead, calculating every possible outcome, every strategy. The car rolled smoothly toward the police station, but Olivia's focus was elsewhere. She wasn't concerned about the holding cell that awaited her, or the fabricated charges they would likely file. She knew they would attempt to break her down, but that was exactly what they wanted. They didn't understand yet that she was the storm they had just unleashed upon themselves. Grant's voice cut through the silence of the car as they neared the station. "You're real calm for someone who's about to spend a long time behind bars," he said with a chuckle, his tone dripping with superiority. Olivia met his eyes in the rearview mirror, her gaze steady, unflinching. "Should I be worried?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with something that made him pause for a split second. The challenge was subtle, but it was there, waiting. "Not yet," Grant replied, his voice growing more assured as he turned back to the road. "But you will be when you see what we've got on you. Trust me, no one's coming to save you. You're going to regret crossing us." Olivia didn't respond, but the small shift in her posture, the faintest tilt of her chin, was enough for Grant to realize she wasn't intimidated. That was fine, he thought. The courts would handle her soon enough. As they pulled into the station parking lot, the building loomed in the distance, a cold, sterile structure that housed everything Olivia knew she had to confront. But she wasn't afraid. She wasn't worried. She was still calculating, still plotting. The calmness that enveloped her was not a sign of submission. It was her armor, her shield. Olivia was prepared for the worst, but she was also prepared to turn the tables. The officers believed they had control, but they hadn't seen anything yet. Inside the police station, the sterile fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an unflattering glow across the police station's stark walls. The hum of the overhead fixtures was the only sound that filled the otherwise quiet space. As Olivia was ushered through the entrance, she could hear the low murmur of officers behind their desks, sipping coffee, passing idle jokes, and exchanging whispers about their latest cases. To them, this was just another night, another arrest, another routine booking. They couldn't have known how far beyond their understanding this particular case would reach. Officer Grant and Reynolds marched Olivia through the station with the swagger of men who believed they had won. Grant, ever the loudmouth, broke the silence as they entered the small booking area. "Got ourselves a big one tonight," he announced with a mix of self-importance and glee. He tossed the small plastic bag of supposed drugs onto the counter with a theatrical gesture, as though he had just handed in a trophy catch. Behind the desk, a tired-eyed officer glanced up. His disinterest was palpable, as though he had seen enough big ones to last a lifetime. The bag landed with a soft thud, its contents casting a faint shadow in the dim light, and the officer scanned it without much care. "Caught her red-handed," Reynolds added, a smug smirk playing on his lips. "Looks like she's been running more than stop signs." But Olivia didn't flinch. She remained composed, her gaze sweeping the room with an analytical sharpness that went unnoticed by the officers around her. She wasn't afraid, far from it. The more they talked, the more she pieced together. Their boasting about evidence they had likely planted, wasn't just careless, it was arrogance. They believed they had won, that they had sealed her fate. But Olivia knew better. Her mind was already mapping out every detail: the position of the cameras, the arrangement of desks, the layout of the entire building. She took note of every movement, every shift in tone, every tell. It was instinct. The result of years spent in high-stakes situations where the smallest mistake could cost everything. This station was small, almost quaint in its banality, but it was full of secrets, and those secrets would soon be exposed. As she was led to the fingerprinting station, Olivia didn't speak. She simply placed her hands on the ink pad, her fingers splayed wide. The officer handling her booking was a young man, fresh-faced and unsure, his fingers hesitating slightly as he worked. He glanced up at her a few times, a trace of uncertainty in his eyes. There was something about Olivia, something different, that made him pause. He knew this wasn't a typical case, but he didn't have the courage to ask questions. In a place like this, questioning senior officers was dangerous. Grant and Reynolds, however, were oblivious to the unease that had begun to seep into the air. Their laughter echoed in the booking area, a hollow sound that only added to the unsettling atmosphere. "What's her story, huh?" Reynolds said with a laugh, leaning against the counter. "Probably thought she could outsmart us, huh?" Olivia's silence didn't faze them. They were too wrapped up in their own victory, too eager to believe that they had captured someone who was nothing more than an average criminal. But Olivia wasn't average. She was far more than they could ever understand. As they finished the booking process, Olivia's mind remained focused. She wasn't worried about what came next. They had made their move, and now it was time for hers. They might think they had control, but Olivia knew how to play the long game. And as she was led to the holding cell, her thoughts were already moving, strategizing, waiting for the right moment to make her next move. She could hear the officers laughing in the break room, but the sound seemed distant now, as though it belonged to another world. Olivia's world was different. Her world was one of careful precision, of silent waiting, of outwitting those who underestimated her, and she knew, deep down, that this would be the moment that would change everything. Olivia's preparation for action. The quiet hum of the police station's HVAC system was the only sound that filled Olivia's small holding cell. The faint flicker of fluorescent lights above cast long shadows across the cold concrete floor, creating an eerie stillness that seemed to press in on her. It wasn't a place anyone would want to be, but Olivia had long ago learned that discomfort was part of the job. In fact, it was part of the plan. She sat on the narrow metal bench, her back straight, her hands still cuffed behind her. The cell was dimly lit, the walls bare except for a small, high window that offered a sliver of the outside world. But Olivia wasn't looking at the window. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and even, her mind far from the cold, unwelcoming space around her. She was calculating, planning, waiting. Every detail of the station, every person she had encountered, was now part of the puzzle she was piecing together. The officers, they believed they had her trapped. They thought they had caught a criminal, nothing more than a woman they could throw into their system, a nameless face to lock away. But Olivia was no ordinary woman. She was trained to blend in, to gather information, to watch and wait until the right moment to strike. And in that moment, she would turn the tables on them, revealing the truth they had so carefully tried to conceal. She had already activated her hidden tracker, a small, inconspicuous device embedded within the hem of her jacket, a standard piece of equipment for any field operative. It had taken less than a second to trigger it, a barely perceptible click that sent out a silent signal, a beacon that would soon reach her team. They would come for her. They always did. But Olivia wasn't relying on them entirely. She had learned long ago that waiting for others to solve your problems was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had to be her own solution. As the hours passed, Olivia remained still, her mind racing through every possible scenario, every piece of information she had gathered. She noted the sounds of footsteps outside her cell, the casual chatter of the officers passing by. Their routines were predictable, their movements set in stone. They didn't know it yet, but they were already dancing to her rhythm. She was the one who controlled this game, not them. The station, small and run down, was full of cracks, literal and metaphorical. It wasn't just a building. It was a microcosm of corruption, of power imbalances, of secrets that festered in the dark. Olivia had already identified the weak points, the security cameras, the officers' routines, the complacency that oozed from the very walls of the place. It was a system that believed it was untouchable, but Olivia knew better. She had exposed far bigger operations than this, and she wasn't about to let this one slide. Outside her cell, Officer Grant and Reynolds were still laughing, convinced of their victory. They had no idea that their arrogant smirks would soon be replaced with expressions of shock and disbelief. They thought they were in control, but Olivia was already moving, already making her play. They had underestimated her, and now they were about to pay the price for that mistake. The time was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The moment when everything would shift, when the facade of authority would crumble and the truth would be exposed. She had been patient, but now the storm was about to break. She wasn't just waiting for her team to rescue her. She was waiting for the right moment to reclaim control, to turn the tables, and to dismantle the lies that had been built around her. With a final deep breath, Olivia opened her eyes, her gaze steady and unflinching. She had spent years preparing for moments like this. Now it was time to execute the plan. Everything she had worked for, everything she had endured, was leading to this very moment. And when it came, she would be ready. Olivia's preparation for action. The cell was a place of quiet desperation for most, but not for Olivia. As the sterile lights flickered overhead, casting faint shadows against the cold concrete, she was not simply biding her time, she was working. The hum of the police station's HVA system was her only companion, the occasional sounds of distant footsteps and muffled voices offering nothing but a subtle reminder of the cage she was locked in. But for Olivia, this confinement was temporary. She was used to waiting for the right moment, waiting for the pieces to fall into place. Her mind raced, calculating each move, anticipating every step. The tracker hidden within the hem of her jacket was already sending its signal to her team, but that was only one part of her plan. In moments like these, in places like these, she needed to be her own ally. Her years of training had taught her that, in the field, relying solely on others could be a fatal mistake. So, she sat still, her breathing slow and controlled, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the weight of the situation, the officers who thought they had her trapped, the lies that were being woven around her. But none of it fazed her. She was already 5 steps ahead. Outside her cell, she could hear the faint chatter of the officers, their voices filled with smug superiority. They thought they had her cornered. They believed their fabricated evidence was airtight, that they could break her down piece by piece. But Olivia knew better. Their arrogance was their downfall. She had seen this kind of complacency before, in others who thought they were untouchable, in others who failed to realize that they had already lost, and now it was her turn to expose them. As the hours passed, Olivia took mental note of everything: the way the officers moved, the cameras positioned above the doors, the slight delays in the station's operations. Nothing escaped her sharp eye. She had memorized the layout of the station long ago, had taken mental notes of every creaking floorboard, every careless glance cast her way. All of it was part of the plan. The key to winning was not just outsmarting the officers. It was knowing their weaknesses, their routines, and exploiting them at the right moment. And that moment was coming soon. She could feel it in the air, the tension building, the storm on the horizon. Olivia wasn't worried about the outcome of the trial or the false charges the officers had piled against her. She wasn't even worried about spending another night in that cell. Her concern was much bigger than that. This was about dismantling the corruption that had infected this station, about showing the officers just how wrong they were about her. When she finally made her move, it would be swift, calculated, and decisive. The illusion of control they had so confidently built would crumble in an instant. But until then, Olivia remained patient. She knew that every second spent in that cell brought her one step closer to the truth being exposed. And as the day began to dawn, with the soft glow of sunlight creeping through the narrow window, Olivia felt the final pieces of her plan click into place. The officers had no idea what they were about to face, but Olivia did. She had spent her life preparing for moments like this, and when the storm hit, it would shake them to their core. If you've been captivated by Olivia's journey so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to follow her story. There's so much more to come, and you won't want to miss a single twist or turn. Join the conversation by commenting below. What do you think Olivia's next move will be? Your insights and thoughts are always welcome. Stay tuned for the next chapter, and as always, thank you for being a part of this thrilling journey.